So welcome to our study of Journey Without Goal, where we're now in the sorry, we're now in the last chapter, which is called Mahāti, which is actually a term that, even though it exists, it is a Sanskrit term, and it also does exist in Tibetan, in the way that one uses Sanskrit in Tibetan. So, but it is actually the way it's employed is rather unique to Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. But it's remember Nalanda Translation Committee, they wrote a little essay on, or they published a little essay on the value of the term Mahāti, because it stands out. But anyway, basically what we mean with Mahāti is what we also often refer to as Dzogchen. And it's a privilege for us to have Trungpa Rinpoche present Dzogchen and present it from the perspective of an understanding of the wider context of modernity and the modern audience. And so while a lot of Dzogchen teaching will actually go straight into either the method or what we call establishing the view, which in the context of the Dzogchen teaching, of the Mahāti teachings, goes beyond words, goes beyond language, and points to that which is beyond language. Well, we find that in many places, and these teachings are like the purest nectar. But what is wonderful with Trungpa Rinpoche is that he can also, he presents this teaching then within the wider context of pointing out things which are helpful for us in the modern context to understand about Mahāti, about Dzogchen. So there is some places that Trungpa Rinpoche goes which is just so immensely helpful for us. So this is just me gushing a bit about the extraordinary qualities of Trungpa Rinpoche's teaching, as usual. But we'll start off with the first section from the Intensifying Devotion in One's Heart. I'm reducing the picture of Trungpa Rinpoche a little bit because it is a bit blurry. There you go. So this is very much this devotional liturgy, which is essentially a beautiful liturgy that induces us to deal with practice. So while there's a lot of teachings, it's something that we could look at, then something like this touches us, or hopefully touches us at a very deep place on the immediate level, in terms of us applying ourselves to the practice of the path. So this is very much all along the lines of recognizing our shortcomings. Jakob writes, I hold on dearly to futile samsara. For the sake of food and clothing, I completely abandon permanent objectives. Though I have everything I need, I constantly want more and more. My mind is duped by insubstantial and illusory things. Guru, think of me. Look upon me quickly with compassion. Grant your blessings so that I am not attached to this life. So the Buddha comes from, and Jakob comes from a place of maturity, where the sage sees how we're fooled. And within this world, and particularly the modern world, there's a very intense engagement with the phenomenal material aspect of us upholding the basic needs that we might have in terms of food, clothing, shelter, medicine, all these things, which of course are essential. But in the modern world, these attend proportions like we have never seen it before. We can look down through the history of sort of civilizations across the planet, and we have never come across a civilization where individuals are so entangled in these material aspects. In and of themselves, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the material aspect, the material aspects of the world. As long as we realize, as long as we have the maturity to have a perspective, a realistic perspective of these very short-lived phenomena, these very short, fleeting, and ultimately futile aspects. As long as we have that perspective, then there's nothing wrong with the material. But the problem is that we, in the midst of this, we abandon these permanent objectives, which are really just like we bring up our children, wishing them to be able to look ahead and plan and establish the conditions for them to have choices, to have the ability to be comfortable and so forth. We recognize the need for planning ahead, but here, with our engagement in what ultimately is futile, then we abandon what really is going to matter. And so that's where we get entangled in things that lead us astray from understanding what are really the permanent, the valid objectives. We can also see our childish entanglement where maybe we don't see it in ourselves, but then we can look in the others. It's always sometimes with these things, when we say, no, I don't have that. I'm not like that. But then Longchen Pahe says it's actually okay then to find these shortcomings in others. Then we can just look at others, and then maybe eventually we can begin to see that we might also have it ourselves. But let's just say that we then do look at others and we say, oh yeah, these people, they have so much and yet they still want more and more. And that's where we can recognize this tendency that happens. The more we have things, the more these things, they sort of entangle us, and we end up actually needing and wanting more and more things. So that's where we would say our mind is duped, fooled, deceived by what in fact is insubstantial, illusory things. So we supplicate the teacher, Guru, think of me, look upon me quickly with compassion, grant your blessings, so that I'm not attached to this life. So again, we're not saying that we shouldn't make provisions for this life. We're not saying we shouldn't be practical. We're not saying that we shouldn't have a solid economy, that we shouldn't have all the necessary practical things in place. But we are saying that the attachment, the entanglement, the lack of perspective, that is the problem. And that's where we supplicate the teacher that we might not be attached to this life. Jakob writes, I cannot endure even the slightest physical or mental pain, yet I am so stubborn that I have no fear of falling into the lower realms. Although I actually see unerring cause and effect, still I do not act virtuously, but perpetuate evil. Guru, think of me, look upon me quickly with compassion, grant your blessings, so that conviction in karma arises in me. So this, of course, departs from what we've learned in the modern world. There's no notion in our schools about the lower realms. There's not really an understanding of how our consciousness drives out the constructions of our world. And so with the sort of reverse, the strange, unique science of our culture, which reverses the obvious primary experiencer and the primary creator of our reality, and rather sees that which is created, namely the apparently, emphasis on apparently solid material, that has primacy. And within this rather naive and profoundly deluded, and also as a result, you could say, pointless perspective and outlook that we have in the modern world, then there's no notion of actually there being what we call the lower realms or the higher realms or any of that. So within our context, we're a little bit challenged. in a traditional Buddhist and many Asian cultures, there is an awareness of the various realms of samsara, and there's also an understanding of where these realms come from. Of course, within the Abrahamic traditions, there is some notion of a soul that passes on after this life, but there's not really an understanding of the dynamics of confusion and enlightenment. So anyway, there might be some of us who have heard the teachings of the 6 realms of samsara many times, and we could say, well, we seem to be rather dim in not really cottoning on to what this entails. And so we suffer from just this basic lack of this basic insensitivity, numbness, and lack of fear about the lower realms. And it's not just about us, but it's also about understanding the plight of others, what others are undergoing in these realms. And the fact is that we can actually see, both in terms of the external natural world, but also in terms of our own psychology, we can see cause and effect. We do something physically or we do something psychologically, and it impacts us. And yet, with that immediate experience that we continuously have, we still seem to be very much caught up in our patterns that perpetuate the suffering and the pain. So when we think of this, it's not so much about good and bad, it's not about some religious prescriptions for what we should do or not do, but it's more just understanding the impact of our actions psychologically and physically, verbally as well. And that's where we have to be surprised actually how we perpetuate what will cause us suffering. So we invoke the teacher and we supplicate that we might have some conviction, some deep sense of and sensitivity to the effect of actions, karma. So Maha-Ati, Dzogchen, Dzogchen. And the Sanskrit term that the Tibetans use is Mahasandhi. But again, and I'll maybe bring that along next time. I remember there's a place where there was a little publication by Nalanda Translation Committee that actually highlights the great, you could say, the virtue of this term Maha-Ati. And it works beautifully. By the way, as an aside, if you Google Maha-Ati, you might come across an article that's called Maha-Ati, and it's been circulating on the web since forever, and it's attributed to Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And it's a wonderful teaching by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. It's Trungpa Rinpoche who taught this, and there was a student of him, Michael Hookham, who now is known under the name as Rigzen Shikpo or something like that. And but anyway, in one of the volumes of the collected works, they actually detailed the evolution of how this ended up being perceived as Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's teaching. And I remember as a young man encountering Chimi Yungdrung Rinpoche. He had a magazine called Vajra, and in there, this teaching by Chögyam Trungpa on Maha-Ati, Dzogchen, which was really it was a beautiful and is an exquisitely beautiful presentation of the spirit, and also you could say pith instruction in the perspective of Ati, Maha-Ati. But in there was a picture of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and it said Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, one of the great masters of Maha-Ati or something like that. And this got picked up, and somehow somebody got it wrong. And like I said, in one of the volumes of the collected works of Chögyam Trungpa, the details are, they find the details there. But then it ended up being attributed to Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. But of course, if you look at the language, it's uniquely Trungpa Rinpoche. But it's a wonderful piece. Since it's there, and this was something that in Trungpa Rinpoche's Sangha, this was, some of you can testify to this, I know, this was circulated as something actually from the start that students would read as something that implied what is the nature of what we're doing here. And so it's something that where you generally have the notion that things like Mahāti, Dzogchen, and so forth, you wait a bit with that. It's, then this was something that was seen as legitimately okay to study right from the start. And certainly for myself, this was an incredibly inspiring introduction to well, Mahāti obviously, but also to what are we doing with Buddhism. So beautiful. So maybe I'll find it. And put it up there. Anyway, I'll put it in the reading folder. Anyway, Mahāti, Dzogchen, Tsogpa Chenpo, Mahasanti. Trungpa Rinpoche says the ninth dhyana, Mahāti or Ati Yoga, is the final stage of the path. It is both the beginning and the end of the journey. It's not final in the sense that we have finished making a statement and we have nothing more to say, but final in the sense that we feel we have said enough. At this level, if there are any further words, they are the creations of space rather than idle remarks. So whenever we come across the notion of Dzogchen and Mahāti teaching, it is regarded as the pinnacle of all the vehicles. So we sometimes have these classifications of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and within then sometimes we even would say it's beyond words. We would say all the previous vehicles, they operate with some conceptual reference points. But within Dzogchen, it points to that which is entirely beyond. And so in Dzogchen, there really is no further method besides just realization itself. And there's a famous quotation from Sakyapandita who would say, this Dzogchen is not a path, it's realization itself. And Tsongtsen Rinpoche, he says, there couldn't be a greater praise of Dzogchen, in that it is then that which is the end of the path, and there's nothing more really to be said. But also, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, there is, in fact, there are some, we could say, expressions that come from this place. And so we have some extraordinary teachings that come from the place of Dzogchen. Trungpa Rinpoche continues, the tantric journey is like walking along a winding mountain path. Dangers, obstacles, and problems occur constantly. There are wild animals, earthquakes, landslides, all kinds of things, but still we continue on our journey, and we are able to go beyond the obstacles. When we finally get to the summit of the mountain, we do not celebrate our victory. Instead of planting our national flag on the summit of the mountain, we look down again and see a vast perspective of mountains, rivers, meadows, woods, jungles, and plains. Once we are on the summit of the mountain, we begin to look down and we feel attracted toward the panoramic quality of what we see. That is Ati style. From that point of view, our achievement is not regarded as finally, but as re-appreciation of what we have already gone through. In fact, we would like to retake the journey we have been through. So Mahāti is the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning. So we could have this sense that, yes, I've gone through all of it. And just have that, we could gloat, saying, I've reached this place. But the thing is, by the very nature, this is not an object of the rather childish sense of conquering and achievement. has nothing to do with that. It's the grand vista of sanity, and that's where there's an appreciation for every aspect of the Buddhist teaching. What we could call is significant with the sage, the Dzogchen sage, is their tremendous appreciation for all the aspects of the path. We would never have a Dzogchen yogi that would be down on, say, the disciplines that we find in all the various vehicles. There is definitely an appreciation of the superiority of the Ati perspective, but what is so superior and what is so wonderful about it, it understands everything really on the path as expressions of that wisdom. So in that sense, the vows of the Pratimoksha, the monastic vows, the path of the Mahayana, all the various aspects of Tantra all make tremendous sense from the point of view of Mahāti. And that's where we're no longer entirely innocent, and yet with that insight, then there's so much appreciation for all the detail that we're perceiving. Ati teachings talk of enormous space. In this case, it is not space as opposed to a boundary, but a sense of total openness. Such openness can never be questioned. Ati Yana is regarded as the king of all the yanas. In fact, the traditional Tibetan term for this yana, Longjur Tapki Tekpa, means imperial yana. It is imperial rather than regal, for while a king has conquered his own country, in order to be an emperor, he has to conquer a lot of other territories and other continents as well. An emperor has no need for further conquests. His rule is beyond conquering. Likewise, Ati is regarded as imperial, because from the perspective of Ati Yoga, Hinayana discipline is seen as spaciousness, Mahayana discipline is seen as spaciousness, and the Tantric yanas as well are seen as spaciousness. If you review what we have been discussing throughout this book, you will see that we have been taking that point of view. We have discussed everything from the perspective of Ati. Because of that, we have been able to view the characteristics of the various yanas and tantric disciplines in terms of openness and spaciousness and inevitability. That notion of wakefulness we have been discussing constantly, is the final wakefulness of Ati Yana, Ati Yoga. And this, of course, this prompts what I think is a really important insight into the work of Chögyam Trungpa, his activity, the nature of him as a teacher, which was a great master of Ati Yoga. Trungpa Rinpoche was an extraordinary Mahasiddha and someone who, from a very early stage, was completely free from delusion and awoke to complete realization. And as such, his teaching, and this is only later, actually after the Vajrayana passed away, that students have become aware of actually how big Trungpa Rinpoche was in Tibet, something that he wouldn't really talk about. He would say I was an abbot of a particular monastery, but all his work as a great treasure revealer, as a Dzogchen master, I personally have never seen this discussed anywhere really. Of course, Trungpa Rinpoche as a teacher of Ati Yoga and so forth, yes, but his accomplishments in Tibet and the legacy that he left behind in Tibet has only recently been sort of, or now it's recently, I don't know, now it's probably 15, 20 years since it's been known, but all the writings of Trungpa Rinpoche, his treasure teachings and so on, I don't think anybody really knew of that. But more than that, when Trungpa Rinpoche introduced Buddhism in the West, we could say, and this is also what he's saying here, right from the start, the Hinayana discipline, the Mahayana, and the approach to Tantra was all really coming from a place of Ati. So while, for example, when we look at the meditation that Trungpa Rinpoche taught, the so-called shamatha vipassana that Trungpa Rinpoche would teach, and very much teaching this from the point of view of what we could call Hinayana, the narrow path of discipline and mindfulness and so on, mindfulness and awareness. As much as this was situated within a language of common sense, rationality, down to earth, directly relating to the kitchen sink of our ordinary life, and very much about just beginning to become properly present within our world. As much as it had that, you could say, immediate practicality about it, then if you are familiar with Hatha Yoga and Mahātha, you would see that the style of this approach is entirely Dzogchen. And so to read Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings on meditation is actually to read Dzogchen instructions. So we should never ever, if we come across Trungpa Rinpoche's style of meditation, just say, oh yeah, well that's shamatha. Yeah, it's shamatha if we don't know better. But if we know Dzogchen, then we know that what Trungpa Rinpoche called shamatha vipassana is in fact really Dzogchen instruction. Of course, there's not the use of all the big Dzogchen words, but the implication and the spirit that we have in Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings on shamatha vipassana and the teachings on Hinayana discipline, they actually prepare the ground for the further Mahayana, and particularly Vajrayana, and particularly Ati approach. So this is, as Trungpa Rinpoche says here, throughout this work here on Journey Without Goal, we're continually talking about how the natural development of all these various aspects of the path in terms of its view and method as leading, you could say, organically leading to this final perspective of Hatha Yoga. Trungpa Rinpoche says, Hatha Yoga, teaching or discipline, is something defined as that which transcends coming, that which transcends going, and that which transcends dwelling. This definition is something more than the traditional tantric slogan of Advaita, or not two, non-duality. In this case, we're looking at things from the level of true reality, not from the point of view of slogan or belief. Things are as they are, very simply, extremely so. Therefore, things are unchanging, and therefore things are open as well. The relationship between us and our world is no relationship because such a relationship is either there or not. We cannot manufacture a concept or idea of relationship to make us feel better. So there's a complete immersion in reality, and not as something that is a particular method or approach, but just a complete, fully participation within our world. And that's actually also why I thought the picture that we have today of the Vijayadhara signifies that. Well, Trungpa Rinpoche never ever sort of engaged in the modern world as a guru. Well, he did, he was a teacher, but he never engaged as being foreign. This is so interesting. Trungpa Rinpoche taught as an insider of modernity. I think there was no doubt an initial moment when Trungpa Rinpoche came to England and so forth, that there was very much a notion that he was an exotic foreigner. And I think also initially Trungpa Rinpoche was, you could say humbly, someone who was learning the ropes. But it doesn't seem to, certainly when my impression, again, this is, some of you have been direct students of the Vijayadhara and many of you know much more about Trungpa Rinpoche's life than I do. But it seems to me that when he came to America, he was very much sort of with the program. He was very much hip to what was going on and very much an insider. And certainly it appears to me that he spoke as an insider, and very often you will see people who would note how Trungpa Rinpoche's English, his language, is far more sophisticated than most of us. Of course, we're also to a large extent indebted to some of the editors, Marvin Casper, John Baker, Carolyn Rose Gimian, Judith Leaf, and others, we've edited Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings in some of the printed format that we have, but nevertheless the ideas and the use of the imagery and the language is so much as an insider, and that is actually reflects what is just being said here in terms of we're not just talking non-duality, but we're just talking a complete, wholehearted, direct presence within reality as it is. So that's why we see Chögyam Trungpa as someone very comfortable. In the modern world, also, there's Dudjom Rinpoche who says at one point, happy in the company of anyone, the child of the lineage of Pema Jungne, you are happy in the company of whoever might be there, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but there is this ease with the phenomenal world. So Trungpa Rinpoche says, from the perspective of Ati, the rest of the yanas are trying to comfort us. If you feel separate, don't worry. There is non-duality as your saving grace. Try to rest your mind in it. Everything is going to be okay. Don't cry. In contrast, the approach of Ati is a blunt and vast attitude of total flop, as if the sky had turned into a gigantic pancake and suddenly descended onto our head, which ironically creates enormous space. That is the Ati approach, that larger way of thinking, that larger view. So in the Ati, there's not really a notion of trying to smooth things over with some method or with some slogans, obviously. There's not anything that's trying to mediate our experience. We're just plonked in there. I would say, as I have said earlier, there's places where I should be a little bit cautious about assuming that I can fully understand the intention, the wisdom intention of Trungpa Rinpoche. And I think the image of the gigantic pancake, I have many years since I read this, but it's still sort of, I have to say, it still boggles my mind a little bit. So, but it's one of these where I think, like, we can just stay with that image. I remember Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche, he would get questions in his teachings, and he would say, that's a really good question. Stay with that. Stay with that. So I have to say also with the image of the gigantic pancake, I'll just stay with that and see what it does. Anyway, the bottom line here is, and this I think is quite clear, it's a blunt and vast attitude of simply just being fully present without trying to mediate again. Trungpa says, Buddhism has a number of schools, primarily divided into the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana traditions, and squabbling goes on among all of them. They all speak the language of totality, and every one of them claims to have the answer. The Hinayanas may say that they have the answer because they know reality. The Mahayanas may say that the Bodhisattva is the best person that we could ever find in the world. Tantric practitioners may say that the most fantastic person is the powerful and crazy yogi who is unconquerable and who has achieved siddhis and magical powers of all kinds. Let them believe what they want. It's okay. But what do those things mean to us personally, as students who want to practice and who want to experience the teachings? So sometimes we can understand these different approaches, Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, of course, in terms of our own progression. And really also see it as, you could say, steps basic to whatever approach that we might be engaged in. But then sometimes, yes, we could say that the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana are reflected in various traditions and in various persons, practitioners or sages. So what does that mean to us? The Mahayana practitioner sees a completely naked world at the level of marrow, rather than skin or flesh or even bones. In the lower yanas, we develop lots of idioms and terms, and that makes us feel better because we have lots of things to talk about, such as compassion or emptiness or wisdom. But in fact, that becomes a way of avoiding the actual naked reality of life. Of course, in Mahayana, in Mahaati, there is warmth, there is openness, there is penetration. All those things are there. But if we begin to divide the Dharma, cutting it into little pieces, as we would cut a side of beef into sirloin steaks, hamburger, and chuck, with certain cuts of beef more expensive than others, then the Dharma is being marketed. In fact, according to Vimalamitra, the reason Mahaati is necessary is because throughout the 8 lower yanas, the Dharma has been marketed as a particularly juicy morsel of food. The Mahaati level is necessary in order to save the Dharma from being parceled and marketed. That is, it is necessary to preserve the wholesomeness of the whole path. So we do talk about the progression of the Buddhist path in terms of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, but we also talk about the Buddhist path in terms of the 9 yanas, and this is particular to Padmasambhava. Although, for example, also Vimalamitra might very well have obviously been privy to this approach, but the 9 yana, you could say, formula, we have that from Padmasambhava, and it in relation to Mahaati, then we would say the first, or rather the Mahaati is the 9th yana. It's the pinnacle of all the vehicles, and we would then say that the 8 lower yanas, they are conceptual, and it's really from the point of view of Ati that we are beyond any concepts at all. So the Ati is really what spells out the result, and it is completely without then any reference points. Again, I'm not familiar with this statement from Vimalamitra, and all I can say is definitely that what we mean with the perfection of Ati is that it operates then beyond any kind of reference point in terms of view and practice. So this is where we could say it comes with this ultimate wholesomeness. But again, this is one of these passages where I would say, please perhaps speak with some of the senior students of the Vidyadhara, or perhaps ponder this personally, and you might have some insights. Trungpa continues, actually, if we could make an Ati Yoga remark, all the yanas are purely creating successively more advanced and mechanized toys. At first, when a child is very young, we give him mobiles to look at, rings to suck, and rattles to shake. Then when the child is more sophisticated, we give him more sophisticated toys, creative playthings, and brightly colored bricks and sticks to put together. We provide even more sophisticated toys as the child becomes more and more inquisitive and sophisticated, and his mind and body are better coordinated. So from the Ati perspective, this is all unnecessary. But then again, the Ati Yoga perspective is the perspective of perfect realization. Until we have the perfect realization, then we have the various vehicles that provide what we call skillful means, upaya, that engages our particular disposition, our particular temperament, capacity, and so forth. So these are all indispensable. So just like all of these toys of the child are indispensable in terms of their development, then ultimately from the Ati perspective, these are in fact just toys. This doesn't mean that Ati looks down on these as being unnecessary, but it's also recognizing the incredible value of the Ati perspective that we're talking about here. So Trungpa continues, finally, at the level of adulthood, we continue to buy toys for ourselves. Even when we're old enough, we may buy ourselves a set of Encyclopedia Britannica or a stereo kit that we can put together. We might even build ourselves a house, the ultimate creative plaything, or we may invent some new gadget. I designed a new kind of motor car, a new kind of airplane, a new kind of submarine. I built it and it actually worked. Isn't that fantastic? we feel that our abilities are becoming much greater, because not only can we build fantastic toys and enjoy them ourselves, but we learn how to sell them, market them. When we become really sophisticated, we might design a zoo or even an entire city and be accepted as important people in our society. It feels fantastic, extremely powerful, and encouraging. But we are still fascinated by our toys. So we could be very successful in this world and have all sorts of credentials and all sorts of things that we have achieved. But again, they're really just external to what we are. They are just things that we occupy ourselves with. They're still toys. According to Ati Yoga, going through the yanas is similar to the process of collecting more and more toys. The more sophisticated and fascinated we become, the more we're actually reducing ourselves to a childlike level. Somehow we are not yet at the level of Mahāti if we're still fascinated by our toys, our occupations, no matter how extensive or expensive they might be. At the Mahāti level, those little tricks that we play to improve ourselves or to entertain ourselves are no longer regarded as anything. But at the same time, they are everything, much vaster than we could have imagined. It is as though we were building a city or a zoo, and suddenly the whole sky turned into a gigantic pancake and dropped on us. There is a new dimension of surprise that we never thought of, we never expected. We never expected the sky to drop on our head. So from the Ati perspective, and sometimes within Ati teaching, there will be a, if not entirely chauvinistic, then very much exposing the flaw in our fascination with whatever methods that we might have. In that Ati is entirely beyond any reference point, then there's also no need for any kind of method beyond just the realization itself. But that again, also while that maturity is there, there is also a perspective of appreciating the methods. Again, I'll leave it to you to ponder the image of the gigantic pancake. Trungpa says there is a children's story about the sky falling, but we do not actually believe that such a thing could happen. The sky turns into a blue pancake and drops on our head. Nobody believes that. But in Mahāti experience, it actually does happen. There is a new dimension of shock, a new dimension of logic. It is as though we were furiously calculating a mathematical problem in our notebook, and suddenly a new approach altogether dawned on us, stopping us in our track. Our perspective becomes completely different. Okay. Trungpa says, our ordinary approach to reality in truth is so poverty-stricken that we don't realize that the truth is not one truth, but all truth. It could be everywhere, like raindrops, as opposing to water coming out of a faucet that only one person can drink from at a time. Our limited approach is a problem. It may be our cultural training to believe that only one person can get the truth. You can receive this, but nobody else can. There are all sorts of philosophical, psychological, religious, and emotional tactics that we use to motivate ourselves, which say that we can do something, but nobody else can. Since we think we are the only one that can do something, we crank up our machine and we do it. And if it turns out that somebody else has done it already, we begin to feel jealous and resentful. In fact, the Dharma has been marketed or auctioned in that way. But from the point of view of Ati, there is all Dharma rather than the Dharma. The notion of one and only does not apply anymore. If the gigantic pancake falls on our head, it falls on everybody's head. I think one thing that would signify or characterize a great master or a great Ati yogi is that there never is a particular attachment to any of the methods. There is living the methods, but there's also seeing the method present in everything. They're seeing the path of the Dharma present in everything. And as such, there's never really any preference to, well, you could obviously say samsara over nirvana, and also the methods over anything else. So there's a remarkably light touch on the part of the great Dzogchen yogi with regards to all the methods of the path. Doesn't mean that the Dzogchen yogi won't be teaching the methods, and we can see in the cases of our teachers how they teach, but also at the same time the lightness of that touch, a complete absence of fanaticism. And so there is the perspective of the sacred. Now in the foundational, it doesn't mean they're not essential, but in the foundational Vajrayana, there is the perspective of sacred outlook. But that is visualized. That is something that requires that we come back to that, you could say, realism, the hard realism of sacred reality. And that we need to return to. And we very often fail to see it, and we need to come back to it continually as we do in sadhana. But from the Ati perspective, this sacred quality is something that's lived continually all the time, every micro moment. The pancake. Trungpa says, in some sense, it is both a big joke and a big message. You cannot even run to your next door neighbor saying, I had a little pancake fall on my head. What can I do? I want to wash my hair. You have nowhere to go. It is a cosmic pancake that falls everywhere on the face of the earth. You cannot escape. That is the basic point. From that point of view, both the problem and the promise are cosmic. Again, this is where Trungpa exceeds beyond the ordinary, well, not ordinary, but we have the many Dzogchen teachings, but I don't think you'll find many Dzogchen teachings that speak about a gigantic pancake landing on your head. And like I said, while I shall refrain from interpreting this, then I think it's also something that probably will mature as we practice the path. It might make tremendous sense. Some of you might already actually be completely clear on what the Vijayadhara means with this. Okay, let's stop at this point. Actually, I'll just read the next line where it says, if you're trying to catch what I'm saying, quite possibly you cannot capture the idea. In fact, it is quite possible that you do not understand a word of it. Okay, good. Let's acknowledge that. And I think as the Vijayadhara would say, we could have a discussion. Yeah. Okay. Okay, somebody sent a link. This looks interesting. I can't really use it here, but anyway, if you could email it to me, then I'll try and have a look sometime. Could you give examples of what Rinpoche called toys about the yanas? Relative compassion would be one, for instance, as well as deity practice. Sure. We would cultivate compassion. We would cultivate sacred outlook. And we would do that as a yoga of aligning ourselves with reality. After all, there are more of the others than there is of us. So relative bodhicitta, relative compassion, is aligning ourselves with how the world actually operates. Being compassionate makes sense. The implication of sacred outlook is seeing phenomena without the overlay of our personal projection. So while that is something which we approach in terms of method, it is something that spontaneously is experienced from the arti perspective. We don't need to cultivate anything. It's naturally there. We would say uncontrived, unfabricated. It's naturally present. So that's where, from the arti point of view, then all the various approaches essentially would be gimmicks. But then again, we have to be careful, and that's why we very often would approach arti with some caution, because yes, as much as we could have that chauvinistic attitude, these are toys, these are gimmicks, then also from the perspective of us working with our present situation as ordinary persons with neurosis, obscurations, etc., then these gimmicks are rather indispensable. So likewise, we would also say that that the toys that children have, they are helpful, yeah, stimulating. But then again, there's a place where we outgrow them, and all the qualities that the toys could stimulate in us, we have mastered them. I hope that makes sense. I'll upload this this piece called Mahati to the resource folder. So while we here looking at an extraordinary, very broad presentation of the Mahati concept, leaving us possibly somewhat baffled, then the Mahati teaching that Michael Chögyam, Reasons Shikpo, compiled, really just his notes actually, but I think we can say that they are pretty verbatim what the Vajrayana said. There's actually some short little verses, and I know people sort of went in and tried to find the original Tibetan, which I'm not sure they succeeded in finding them, but anyway, there's essentially some short little lines, and then there's Trungpa Rinpoche's commentary on that, and that actually would complement very well the present discussion that we're having. Yeah. Good morning, La. So then there's a question. When you say Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings of shamatha, well, he would normally actually refer to shamatha vipassana. If you look in Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings, he usually always speaks about shamatha vipassana. Anyway, when you say Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings on shamatha is an arti teaching, are you referring to the return to open awareness? Well, I'm not saying that Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings on shamatha is arti teaching, but I'm saying it comes from the arti perspective, the arti place, and you could say is a continual open invitation to proceed towards the arti teaching. But then you say, are you referring to the return to open awareness? Yes, that is an example. Rather than sort of going into this sort of absorption, then returning to open awareness is a very difficult. It's a very different approach. Yeah, very different approach. Then there's a comment here. We start with a big pancake in our heads and wait using toys until the pancake returns. Okay. What does la mean? Oh, la. Oh, it's it's a yeah, it's actually a polite way. You know, Tibetans and Bhutanese, they use this, you know, how are you today, La? Or hello, Jakob La. So that's La. So it's being polite. Is there a way to merge fabricated techniques like visualization practice with unfabricated perspective of Ati? Very much, and a wonderful question. Thank you. Yes, we do that. And this is where, for example, we would say sometimes we talk about the development and completion stages in unity, the unity of these two approaches. Because as much as we practice visualization practice, we also do it with the knowledge or the insight that this is actually the true nature of things as they are. A bit like, and Chögyam Rinpoche, he would say, when we do visualization practices, it's not as if we're imagining a piece of wood to be a piece of gold. Rather, it is seeing gold as gold. And the image that we have is, for example, if we have jaundice and we see a conch as yellow, then we also know that it is actually white, and that it's just due to our particular disease, our distortion, that we're seeing it as yellow. So we know it's white, and yet we are seeing it as yellow. And so likewise also with the insight that we have of Ati, of knowing the natural openness of reality and the purity of phenomena, then while we don't see it, knowing that it is how it actually is, then visualization practice is what enables us to align ourselves with that reality. So that's where we could say visualization practice is just actually visualizing things as they are at a time when we're seeing them very much with the optics of our deluded karmic projections. And someone says, really appreciates Trungpa's teaching. He is so great. Yes, he is. Yeah. All right. What do you think? Any further comments? Okay. Oh, this is wonderful. Someone says, seeing and hearing Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings brings tears to my eyes. Yeah, me too. Someone else said, oh, this is wonderful. Speechless. Feel so happy to have been born at this time. Someone says, I can't think. There's a pancake on my head. The problem and the promise are cosmic. Something to stay with. Yeah. Okay. Someone says, I'm echoing everyone's sentiments, pancakes and all. In the beginning, the calling for the Guru from afar. It's remember me about the parting from the four attachments. Yes, yes, yeah. Parting from the four attachments, very much. But you know, it's interesting. The last of the parting from the four attachments. You know what it says? If there is fixation, there is no view. And that's actually what we're also talking about here in all of this pancake bliss. That if there is any fixation reference point, we're not seeing clearly. So that's also, you could say, the last of the parting of the four attachments. If there is fixation, there is no view. It actually is indicative of what we're talking about here, the Ati perspective. So that coming from the Sakya tradition. And of course, all the various traditions that we have, Nyingma, Sakya, Kaji, Gelu, all of these traditions, they all, in one way or another, are leading us to that same place. Yeah. So fortunate to be able to learn from his teaching, indeed. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And I think we'll conclude dedication. Oh. Through this virtue, may all beings throughout existence awaken together without a single being left behind. In the pure realm of the luminous essence, the ground of the great perfection, may they remain inseparable from the kayas and wisdoms. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. You're welcome, La. See you next week. Oh, Queenstown. Beautiful place. Watch out, now the Australians will be coming over. You'll be, how do you say, under siege from Australians coming to visit Queenstown soon. Okay, bye.